The alarm on David Carter's phone went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. He lay still for a moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been spreading slowly since November like a country on an old map, finding new territory. He had meant to tell the landlord. He had meant to do a lot of things. He sat up carefully, the mattress springs wheezing beneath him, and listened. Down the hall, behind the door with the paper stars taped to it. Lily's door, there was no sound. No coughing. That was the first thing he always checked. Silence meant she was still breathing easy. Silence was a gift. He padded to the kitchen in his socks, which had a hole in the left heel that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The kitchen was small enough that you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. A fact that Lily had demonstrated at least a dozen times, always with the satisfaction of someone making an important scientific discovery. He put the kettle on and opened the refrigerator out of habit more than hunger. 2 eggs. Half a container of orange juice. A lump of cheddar that was beginning to go at one corner. He closed the door. On the counter, beside the kettle, was a notebook. He'd been keeping a running tally of their expenses in it since March. Because the app on his phone kept crashing, and he didn't trust the numbers he couldn't see with his own eyes. He flipped it open to the most recent page. The handwriting was small and crowded, the way handwriting gets when a person is trying to make the paper last. Rent, $1,150. Due Friday. Lily's albuterol prescription. $87 with the discount card. $210 without. Electric bill. $134. Past due. Groceries. Trying to keep it under $200. He did the math in his head, the same math he'd been doing for 6 months, and arrived at the same impossible sum. He closed the notebook. David Carter was 41 years old. He had been a good husband. He had tried to be a good husband, anyway, which is not always the same thing but is usually the best a person can manage. Ellen had died 22 months ago from a pulmonary embolism, sudden, without warning, the way all the worst things happen. He had been at work when it happened. He had been loading inventory at the distribution center where he worked at the time, and Ellen had been home with Lily, and by the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing to be done. The grief counselor the hospital had referred him to once, they'd gone once, which was all he could afford, had said that it was normal to feel like the world had shifted on its axis, that nothing would feel level for a while. She had been right about that. Nothing had been level since. He'd lost the distribution center job 2 months after Ellen died. Not because of performance, his supervisor, a fair-minded man named Gerald, had told him he was sorry, that it wasn't about David personally, that the company was restructuring. David had nodded and taken the severance envelope and driven home in silence. He had not told Lily about it for 2 days, because she had enough to process, and he needed time to build a face that wouldn't scare her. Since then, temporary work through a staffing agency. Moving furniture. Cleaning office buildings on weekends. A 4-month stretch with a landscaping crew that ended when the owner's son came back from college and needed the hours. He'd done some electrical repairs for neighbors, nothing licensed. Just the practical knowledge he'd picked up over the years, until someone warned him about liability. He was good with his hands, always had been. He just couldn't figure out how to turn that into something stable. The eviction notice had appeared on their door 2 weeks ago. Not the final notice, the warning. The one that said, "This is what comes next if you don't handle this." He'd taken it down before Lily could read it, folded it into quarters, and put it in the back of his sock drawer. It was a Tuesday morning when he found the posting. He'd been at the public library, because the library had computers and decent Wi-Fi, and the librarian, an older woman named Patricia, had never once made him feel ashamed for being there. The posting was on the city's General Employment Board, and it was not glamorous. Sterling Group facilities and maintenance staff, overnight shift, full-time, benefits eligible after 90 days. Competitive hourly rate. Sterling Group. He knew the name the way everyone in the city knew it, a technology and consulting firm that had renovated half a block downtown, whose founder had been on the cover of business magazines, whose headquarters was a glass tower that caught the morning light, and turned it gold. They were known, among other things, for hiring standards that were legendarily exacting. He sat with the posting for a long time. His reflection looked back at him faintly from the dark computer screen when it dimmed from inactivity. Then he filled out the application. That evening, Lily came to the kitchen while he was washing the 2 dinner plates. She was 8 years old and small for her age, with Ellen's brown eyes and his stubborn chin, and she moved through the apartment with the preternatural quietness of children who have learned that adults are sometimes fragile. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, Bug. I saved the last piece of bread. It's on the counter. You should eat it." He kept his eyes on the plate in his hands. "I'm not hungry. You didn't eat dinner. I had some earlier." He hadn't. "Go back to bed. It's a school night." He heard her small feet on the linoleum, and then the sound of her door closing, and then the silence that was better than coughing but still felt like something pressing against his ribs. He dried his hands and looked at the bread on the counter. He ate it standing up, in the dark, looking out at the alley, where a cat was picking its way carefully between the trash cans. The interview was scheduled for Thursday at 9 in the morning. He had one collared shirt that was still presentable navy blue, the one he'd worn to Ellen's cousin's wedding 3 years ago. He ironed it the night before with the second-hand iron that sometimes spat rust-colored water. And he hung it on the back of the bathroom door, and he told himself not to think too hard about what it meant if this didn't work out. He told himself to just go in there and be honest. It was all he had left to work with. Amelia Sterling's calendar for Thursday began at 6:15. She had been awake since 5, which was not unusual. She slept the way certain people in certain roles sleep, lightly, in installments, with one part of her mind always standing guard. She had been told, by a therapist she'd seen briefly 2 years ago, that this was consistent with a kind of sustained hypervigilance. She'd found the observation accurate but not particularly actionable, and had stopped going after 4 sessions. She was 36 years old and had been the CEO of Sterling Group for 4 years, since her father, the founder, the man on the magazine covers, had handed her the company in a ceremony that the business press had treated with approximately the same gravity as a coronation. She had not wanted the coronation. She had wanted to earn it, which she had, but that was a distinction the press was largely uninterested in. Her office was on the 14th floor and looked out over the city in 3 directions. She rarely sat at the desk to look at the view. She stood at it, usually, the way a ship's captain stands at the wheel, not because she was performing authority, but because sitting made her feel like she was waiting for something to happen to her. And Amelia Sterling did not wait. At 8:45, her head of human resources, a meticulous man named Christopher Hale, appeared at her door with a tablet and the look of someone who had prepared extensively for a 2-minute conversation. "Morning hiring review," he said. "Maintenance positions. 7 candidates. 4 of them are straightforward approvals. 2, I'd like your input on. 1 is a borderline situation background check, flagged a 2-year gap in employment, which turned out to be a medical leave. His paperwork is in order." "That's not a borderline situation," Amelia said. "Approve him." Christopher made a note. "The overnight shift position, we have 1 opening, and I've narrowed it to 3 candidates. All qualified on paper, though 1 is overqualified, which gives me pause." "Overqualified how?" "Former facilities supervisor. Took a series of temporary positions over the past 2 years. His application materials he was thorough. More thorough than we usually see for this role. He included a maintenance skills inventory and a brief letter about his daughter." Amelia held out her hand for the tablet. Christopher passed it over. She scrolled. The letter was short 8 lines, single-spaced, written in the plain syntax of someone who was not accustomed to writing letters, but understood that clarity was a form of courtesy. "I am applying for this position because I need stable income and reliable benefits. I have a daughter who is 8 years old and has asthma. I am a hard worker and I do not require supervision. I would be grateful for the opportunity." She scrolled up to the header. Name, address, date of birth, Employment history. She stopped. The tablet stayed very still in her hands. David Carter. The room did not change. The light through the windows was the same. Christopher was still standing in the same posture, waiting. But Amelia felt something shift in the space behind her sternum. The way a room feels different when a window is opened. Not colder, not warmer, just suddenly connected to something outside itself. She had not thought of that name in a long time. She had thought of the night, sometimes. The feeling of it, the rain, the cold. The specific quality of despair that comes when you are 28 years old and have just been told by someone you trusted that the investment you gave him was gone, that he was sorry, that there was nothing left. She had thought of the warmth that had appeared unexpectedly in that darkness. But she had not let herself think of the name, because thinking of the name felt like something she hadn't earned yet. She looked at the date of birth on the application. 41. That would be right. She looked at the address. 2 miles from where he had been working when she'd met him. She did not look up at Christopher for a long moment. This one, she said finally, setting the tablet on the desk and pointing to the name without touching it. Do not remove him from consideration. I want him to have a full interview. He's scheduled for 9, Christopher said. Actually, he may already be in the lobby. Good. She moved to the window. Make sure the panel is complete. I want to review the recording afterward. Christopher, who had worked for Amelia Sterling for 3 years and prided himself on reading the room correctly, understood that he was being dismissed and that he should not ask any of the questions occurring to him. He gathered his tablet and left. Amelia stood at the window for a while, looking at the city below. Somewhere in that lobby, a man in a navy shirt was waiting, a man who did not know her name, who had never needed to know it. The lobby of Sterling Group was the kind of lobby that made David feel the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to be. It was all pale marble and high ceilings, and the low, precise hum of air systems maintaining a temperature that was probably considered comfortable by people who owned coats as investments rather than necessities. A large abstract sculpture occupied the center of the space, dark bronze, angular, reaching upward. He spent a few seconds wondering what it was supposed to mean, then stopped, because that kind of wondering was a luxury, and he was here for a job. The receptionist, young, polished, professional, in the way that seemed to require practice, directed him to the 4th floor. He rode the elevator alone and watched his reflection in the polished doors. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that doesn't give much away, wearing a shirt that was ironed carefully but was still a shirt that had attended someone else's wedding. He looked like what he was. He hoped that was enough. The interview room had a long table, 3 people on one side, and a chair on the other. He had been in rooms like this before, on better days, and the configuration never changed. It was always designed to remind you which side of the table you were on. The 3 interviewers introduced themselves. The one in the center was named Victor Marsh, the facilities director, gray-templed and efficient. On his left was a woman named Sandra Pruitt from HR, who smiled in the way that is functionally identical to not smiling. On his right was a younger man named Drew Callahan, whose role David didn't quite catch. What David did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that on the 14th floor, in a room he would not be invited into, a 4th person was watching through a live camera feed. That person had a cup of coffee she was not drinking and a notebook she was not writing in. The interview proceeded. Victor asked about his previous employment with the methodical patience of someone checking boxes. And David answered honestly, including the gaps, including the landscaping crew, including the reason he'd left each position. He did not embellish. He did not perform enthusiasm. He spoke in the plain, declarative sentences that had always been his natural register. Sandra asked about his comfort with overnight shifts, about physical endurance requirements, about his experience with industrial cleaning equipment. He answered accurately. He'd used most of the equipment she named in his temporary work. He could learn the rest. Then Drew Callahan, the younger one, the one whose role David hadn't caught, leaned forward with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to ask his question. Let me ask you something hypothetical, Drew said. Say you're working overnight, and a senior employee comes through and speaks to you in a, let's say, condescending way. Dismisses you. How do you handle that? There was a quality to the question that David recognized. It was a test, but not the kind that was looking for a policy answer. It was looking to see what the man was made of. He thought for a moment. Not because he needed to, the answer was already there. Had been there for a long time, but because he wanted to say it properly. "I've been spoken to like that before," he said. "In different jobs. You learn pretty quickly that how someone treats the person cleaning up after them tells you everything about them and nothing about you." He paused. "As long as I'm doing honest work and bringing home money for my daughter, someone else's opinion of my job title doesn't change anything that matters." The room was quiet for a moment. Victor made a small notation on his pad. Sandra's not smile shifted into something that was almost the real thing. Drew settled back in his chair with the expression of someone whose question got answered better than he'd expected. On the 14th floor, Amelia Sterling pressed pause on the feed and looked at the frozen image of the man at the table. His posture was straight. His hands were folded in front of him. He looked tired. The way people look tired when they've been tired for a long time and have stopped fighting it. She pressed play again. The call came to David's phone at 4:17 that afternoon. He was at the pharmacy, doing the math on whether this month's prescription would fit in the budget, when the Sterling Group number appeared on his screen. He stepped outside into the cold and answered it. Christopher Hale's voice was professionally neutral, which David had learned over years of job searching meant nothing either way, until the next sentence arrived. "Mr. Carter, we'd like to offer you the overnight maintenance position. Can you start Monday?" David stood on the sidewalk with his hand in his pocket and his eyes on a crack in the pavement and said yes. His voice was steady. That was something he had gotten good at, keeping his voice steady, while the rest of him did whatever it needed to do privately. He went back inside and bought the name-brand prescription. He started on a Monday, which was how most things in his life had started. Without ceremony, simply by showing up. The overnight crew at Sterling Group consisted of himself, a heavy-set, good-natured man named Frank DeLuca, who was the senior maintenance worker and had been with the company for 11 years, a younger woman named Bria, who did the third-floor cleaning circuit and listened to audiobooks through one earbud while she worked, and an older security guard named Raymond Kowalski, who sat at the ground-floor desk from 10 to 6 and brought his own thermos of coffee because, as he explained to David on the first night, the building's coffee machine was unpredictable at best and a psychological hazard at worst. David learned the building. He was methodical about it, not because he'd been told to be, but because that was how he approached any space he was responsible for. He memorized which elevators were running slow, which restroom on the 7th floor had a pressure problem, which loading dock door needed to be lifted at a specific angle to close properly. He wrote it all in a small spiral notebook he kept in his back pocket, because he believed in writing things down. The coffee machine that Raymond had warned him about was a commercial unit in the 6th floor break room. It had been producing inconsistent results, sometimes burning the grounds, sometimes running cold, and he could see from the scale buildup around the group head that it hadn't been descaled properly in probably 18 months. He asked Frank if there was a maintenance protocol for it. Frank shrugged. "Facilities calls someone if it stops working entirely. Otherwise, it's above our pay grade." David spent 40 minutes on his break, researching the model on his phone, then spent another 40 minutes the following night cleaning and calibrating it with materials from the supply closet that were, technically, already there for the purpose. He didn't tell anyone. He just did it. By Thursday, the 6th floor break room had become slightly more popular during late-night work sessions. On Friday, he helped Raymond carry a heavy storage cabinet from one end of the security desk alcove to another, because Raymond had mentioned his back had been bothering him and the cabinet was in the wrong place. On Saturday, he noticed that the 8th floor supply closet had a lighting fixture that had been flickering the kind of slow, erratic flicker that would eventually become a headache, and he replaced the ballast during his circuit. He did not do these things to impress anyone. He did them because they needed doing, and he was there, and he knew how. In her office on the 14th floor, Amelia Sterling received the security camera access that her office had always had, a standard executive feature that she rarely used because she was generally more interested in outcomes than surveillance, and she began, quietly and without announcement, to check it. She watched him move through the building, the unhurried way he worked, the pauses he took, not idleness, but the particular stillness of someone assessing a situation before acting. She saw him pick up a piece of broken plastic from the lobby floor, a small piece, the kind everyone else had stepped around for 2 days, and carry it to the trash rather than leaving it for the next circuit. She saw him hold the elevator for a junior analyst who was rushing at 11:15 at night, the small, unremarked courtesy of it. She saw him sit in the break room at 1:15 in the morning, during his half-hour break, and call his daughter. She couldn't hear the conversation from the camera feed, but she could see his face change. The same face that stayed level and composed all night, measured, contained, giving nothing away, softened when he looked at his phone screen. He laughed at something the small voice on the other end said. He put his hand over his mouth when he laughed, the way people do when they're trying not to make too much noise. Almost enough for the prescription. Bug, she read from his lips, or thought she did. Or maybe she was filling in what she already knew. She turned off the feed at 1:22 and sat in the quiet of her office for a long time. She was 28 the night she met him. She had been in the city for 2 years by then, working in the finance department of a mid-sized consulting firm, saving carefully, believing in the logic of effort. She had met a man named Preston Holt, charming, well-dressed, articulate in the way that certain people are articulate as a form of misdirection, who had convinced her to invest the money she'd saved over 2 careful years. Not invest through a firm, not with proper documentation, but informally, a handshake and a glossy pitch deck, and a story about a real estate opportunity that was, she later understood, entirely invented. When she confronted him about the money, he'd apologized and left. She'd spent 2 hours sitting in her car in the parking garage trying to process the specific arithmetic of what had happened. She had trusted someone, and that trust had been used against her, and now the money was gone. And she was on her own. And the city suddenly felt enormous and hostile in a way it hadn't before. She'd driven without direction for a while. The rain had started somewhere around 9 o'clock. Her car had run over something. She'd heard the pop, felt the steering go loose, and she'd pulled over on a street she didn't know, in a neighborhood she'd never been to, and sat in the front seat while the rain hit the roof and the tire went flat, and she tried to decide which direction things got better from here. The garage had been 2 buildings down from where she'd pulled over. The lights were still on. A man in a gray work shirt had been closing up for the night. He'd seen her car. He'd come over without being asked. She'd told him she was fine. He'd looked at the tire and said, kindly but not gently, that she wasn't fine, and it would take him 15 minutes if she'd let him help. She'd let him. While he changed the tire in the rain, she'd sat in the car and cried, which she'd been holding off doing for 2 hours and could no longer manage to postpone. He'd handed her a fast food napkin through the window without comment, which was exactly the right response. When the tire was done, he'd knocked on the window and told her the spare would hold but she should replace it within a week. Then he'd paused. "You want coffee?" he said. "I was about to make some. It's the bad kind, but it's hot." She'd said yes before she'd decided to. They'd sat in the small waiting room of the garage on plastic chairs while rain slid down the windows, and he made coffee in a machine that was very similar to the one on the 6th floor of Sterling Group that would later require descaling. He hadn't asked what was wrong. He'd waited, and eventually she told him some of it enough, the shape of it, and he'd listened without offering opinions she hadn't asked for, which was a rarer skill than most people understood. He had a daughter, he'd told her, 3 years old. His wife was at home with her. He'd been trying to save up for a better space, something bigger than the garage, maybe a real shop someday. When she'd gotten up to leave, she'd reached for her wallet. He'd waved it off. "Don't worry about it. The tire. Seriously, don't." She'd stood at the door for a moment, looking at him. He'd been wiping down the tire iron, not looking at her, not waiting for thanks. "Just finishing the job. I don't know your name," she'd said. "David," he'd said. She'd nodded. She hadn't given him hers. As she was leaving, he'd called after her, not urgently, just plainly, the way someone says a thing because it's true, and true things deserve to be said. "It gets better than tonight. That much I can tell you." She'd gotten back in her car and driven home and spent the next 2 hours writing down everything she needed to do to rebuild from zero. The list had been the beginning of everything. She had looked for the garage once, a year later, when she was in a better position and wanted to do something she hadn't been able to do at the time. It had been gone, the space was under renovation for a different purpose. She'd asked around, but David was a common name, and she didn't have a last name to work with, and she was very busy, and she had told herself she would look again later. Later had kept getting postponed. Now, on the 14th floor of the building she ran, in a role she had built from the inside out over 8 years of work that her father had made possible but that she had made real. Now she knew his last name. The problem with Sandra Pruitt was not that she was unkind. It was that she was the kind of person who had organized her professional identity around process and hierarchy, and David Carter was a disruption to both. A maintenance worker who had been quietly noted, she could see it in the comments, feel it in the hallway attention by people above her pay grade. She had not been told anything directly. But Sandra Pruitt had worked at Sterling Group for 7 years and had developed a precise radar for when the atmosphere around a situation was different from what the paperwork said. It started with small things, a task reassignment that pushed David's circuit to include 3 additional floors without a corresponding adjustment in hours. Sandra had signed the form. He'd completed the extra floors. He hadn't said anything. Then a missing supply order. A cleaning solution he'd requisitioned through the standard channel that hadn't arrived, and when he'd followed up, the request was nowhere in the system. He'd ordered through a different channel. The solution arrived. Then, on a Wednesday 3 weeks into his tenure, an incident report appeared on the facilities director's desk, claiming that a set of vendor documents had gone missing from the 8th floor conference room after David's overnight cleaning pass. Victor Marsh had called David in at the end of his shift, not aggressively, but with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he might be being used as an instrument and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. David had listened to the description of the incident. He'd asked when the documents had last been confirmed present. He'd asked whether the cleaning log showed he'd actually entered that conference room that night. The log showed he'd been working a different wing due to a plumbing issue that had redirected his circuit. Victor had looked at the report. He'd looked at the log. He'd said, slowly, "That's all, David." And David had understood that something had been settled. He'd walked back to the maintenance floor and started his end-of-shift paperwork and hadn't said another word about it. Bria, the woman from the 3rd floor circuit, found him at the equipment room 10 minutes later. "That was Sandra's report," she said quietly, not looking at him, organizing her cleaning cart with excessive precision. "Okay," David said. "She does this sometimes." A pause. "She did it to Frank's last assistant." The assistant quit after 2 months. David filed his paperwork without answering. He was tired in the way that accumulates, not the tiredness of a single long night, but the tiredness of months of keeping everything upright through effort that nobody sees. Then Lily had her bad night. He got the call during his lunch break on a Thursday. His sister-in-law, Barbara, who picked Lily up from school when he was on the overnight shift. Lily had used her inhaler twice in 4 hours, and it wasn't helping. They were at the urgent care clinic. He should come. He went to Frank and asked if he could leave. Frank, who had 3 children of his own and understood the specific gravity of a sick kid, told him to go and covered the rest of his circuit without discussion. David left. The urgent care clinic smelled like disinfectant and anxiety, which is the smell of all places where people go when something is wrong and they're hoping it isn't worse than it is. Lily was sitting on the examination table in one of those paper gown things they give you, which were not designed with the dignity of 8-year-olds in mind, and she looked small and tired and was holding a stuffed rabbit that had been with her since she was 3. "Hey, Bug," David said. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was raspy. "I didn't want Barbara to call you." "Barbara was right to call me. You had work. Work can wait." He sat beside her while the doctor reviewed her breathing, adjusted her medication protocol, and explained that what she needed was rest and a properly maintained treatment plan, and ideally, a living environment with better air quality. The doctor said this last part looking at his chart, not at David, which was the polite way of saying something impolite. They got home at 2 in the morning. He settled Lily into her bed with her rabbit and the extra blanket she liked. and sat in the chair in the corner of her room until her breathing steadied into the slow rhythm of sleep. Then he went to the kitchen table and opened his notebook and stared at the numbers without adding anything to them. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have seen, was that a car had followed his bus from the clinic, not in a sinister way, not in the way of surveillance, but in the way of someone who had made a decision and was working up the nerve to follow through on it. Amelia Sterling sat in the back of her car and looked at the building where David Carter lived. She'd had the address from his file. She'd told herself she wasn't going to use it that way, and then she had. Because sometimes the things you tell yourself and the things you do are briefly in conflict before one of them wins. The building was a 3-story walk-up with a fire escape running up the front and a broken intercom by the door. A light was on in a second-floor window. She watched it for a while. She had known, intellectually, that his circumstances were difficult. She had read his application. She had seen the prescription receipts in the expense reports that came through the Employee Assistance Program. She hadn't been looking for them. But she had standing access to flagged cases, and his name had appeared in a welfare check request that his sister-in-law had submitted on his behalf to the program 2 weeks ago. She had approved the request and routed it forward, and tried not to think about it too hard. But sitting outside the building and looking at the light in the window was different from knowing something intellectually. It made the information into a person. She thought about what he'd said in the interview. As long as I'm doing honest work and bringing home money for my daughter. Someone else's opinion of my job title doesn't change anything that matters. He'd said it simply, without performance, the way he'd said everything. She thought about the tire iron in the rain, the bad coffee in the plastic chairs, the napkin through the car window. She thought about what it had cost him to come into that lobby in the ironed navy shirt, and what it was costing him every day to stay. Her driver cleared his throat gently, which was his way of asking if she needed anything. "No," she said. "Just give me a minute." She gave herself the minute. Then, she took out her phone and scheduled a meeting. The meeting invite that appeared on David's schedule, sent through the internal calendar system, marked simply, "Brief check-in, CEO office." 3 p.m. Friday caused him the particular anxiety of receiving unexpected attention from someone with power over your employment. He arrived at the 14th floor 2 minutes early, which was how he always arrived everywhere. The executive assistant, a composed young man named Marcus, showed him to a sitting area adjacent to the main office and offered him water, which he accepted because he was in the habit of accepting small kindnesses when they were offered. When Amelia Sterling came in, she was alone. He had seen her once, from a distance. In the first week, she had walked through the lobby with the stride of someone who has somewhere to be and knows precisely how to get there. She had not looked in his direction. He had not expected her to. He was the overnight maintenance man. She sat across from him now. She was wearing something simple and dark, and she had the kind of self-possession that comes from having been tested repeatedly and having responded each time by getting steadier. He recognized it. He'd seen it in veterans he'd worked alongside, in his sister-in-law after their mother died, in the mirror sometimes on the days when he was more tired than afraid. "Thank you for coming up," she said. "Of course." He meant, "I didn't have a choice. You're the CEO." But he was too experienced in this kind of meeting to say that. She had a file folder in front of her, which she didn't open. She looked at him for a moment, really looked. The way people rarely do in professional settings, because professional settings tend to discourage direct looking, and he felt himself become very still, in the way that animals become still when the air changes around them. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to let me get through it before you respond, because I've thought about how to say this for a long time, and I'm still not certain I'll get it right." He nodded. 5 years ago," she said, "I was in a very bad situation. I was on a street in the warehouse district, in the rain, with a flat tire, and nothing in my account, and a level of despair that I hadn't felt before and haven't felt since." She paused. "A man changed my tire. He made me coffee. He listened to me and didn't make me feel stupid for what had happened to me. When I tried to pay him, he wouldn't take it. When I left, he told me it would get better than that night." David was very still. "I never forgot him," she said. "I looked for him once and couldn't find him. His name was David." The room was quiet for a long moment. He said, slowly, carefully. The garage on Alameda Street. Yes. You had a he stopped. He was putting something back together from a very long time ago. Something he'd filed away in the category of things that happened, and then the day moved on. A young woman in the rain, a beaten-up sedan with a spare that needed air. She'd been crying but trying not to. He'd made the coffee because it was what he had. He remembered the napkin. He almost always kept napkins because Lily was 3, and toddlers were chaos, and he was always in some version of cleanup mode. You were the one with the napkin. I was the one with the napkin. He looked at his hands. He thought about what the garage had been. The few square feet of it. The tools. The hope he'd carried around about the shop that would come someday. The shop had not come. Ellen had gotten sick. Everything had rearranged. I didn't know who you were, he said. I know. I still didn't know when I applied. I just needed. I know, she said, more gently. That's not why I asked you here. I asked you here because... She stopped, reorganized. When your name came across my desk, I had to make a decision about whether to pretend I didn't recognize it, or to tell you the truth. I spent 3 weeks trying to pretend I didn't recognize it, and that felt dishonest, and I don't like feeling dishonest. He looked at her. You've been watching me. The cameras are standard executive access, she said. I want to be transparent about that. What did you see? She thought about the camera at 1:15 in the morning and his face when he was talking to his daughter. She thought about the supply closet on the 8th floor and the ballast he'd replaced without being asked. She thought about Raymond and the cabinet. Someone who still does the same things he did 5 years ago, she said, for the same reasons. He looked at the window. The city was doing its afternoon thing out there, traffic, light, the general business of the world that continues indifferently through personal history. The coffee machine on the 6th floor, he said, was better than it's been in 2 years, she said. Yes. He almost laughed. It came out as a small exhalation, not quite a laugh but the shape of one. She did not move for a moment. Then she said, if I hadn't been so stubborn that night, if I'd driven past, if I hadn't stopped, I probably would have found another way eventually. I like to think I would have. But I know that what you said, and how you said it, was something I needed at exactly the right moment. And I never got to tell you that. So, that's what I'm doing now. David Carter was not a man who cried easily. He'd gotten himself through 22 months of grief and financial collapse, and the specific exhaustion of parenting a sick child alone by treating emotions as information rather than performance, processing them privately, and returning to the surface, steady. He was steady now, but his jaw tightened, and he looked at the corner of the ceiling for a moment before he looked back at her. I didn't do anything special, he said. I did what you do for someone who needs help when you happen to be there, and you can. That's not, he shook his head. That's the basic thing. That's just what people are supposed to do. Yes, she said. And you'd be surprised how many people don't. The offer was not, as he'd half expected, some dramatic gesture, a check, a corner office, a promotion to a position he wasn't qualified for. Amelia Sterling had thought carefully about this. What she proposed was a position of facilities operations manager, a real one, with real responsibilities, leading the maintenance and building operations team across 2 of Sterling's 3 campuses. It was a significant step up from overnight cleaning. It was also, she explained, a position that had been vacant for 4 months because every candidate they'd interviewed had either been overqualified in the wrong ways or underqualified in the essential ones. The essential ones being what, he said? Judgment. The ability to see what needs doing without being told. The ability to treat the people around you like they matter, because they do. She paused. You fixed the coffee machine without being asked. You covered extra floors without complaint. You stayed on after the document incident because you'd evaluated the situation correctly and decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of making you leave. She set the folder on the desk between them. I'm not offering you this because of 5 years ago. I'm offering it because you've spent 4 weeks demonstrating that you can do it. He looked at the folder. He didn't open it. I don't have the degree. You don't need the degree for this role. The degree requirement is on the posting because HR includes it by default. I'm the person who decides what the role actually requires. There'll be people who think it doesn't look right. That you hired the janitor. There are people in this building who think a lot of things that I've decided not to organize my decisions around. She met his eyes. Are you telling me you can't do the job? No. Are you telling me you don't want it? He was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, he thought about Lily on the examination table holding the rabbit. He thought about the notebook with its crowded handwriting. He thought about the spare tire, and the woman at the bus stop behind him, and the paper that said this is what comes next. I think I can do it, he said. I think you can too. The benefits. Full coverage from day one, she said. I've already made the exception. It's in the offer letter. He opened the folder. He read slowly, the way he read everything. With the full attention of someone who has learned that the details are where everything actually lives. He looked up. I need to talk to my daughter. Amelia nodded. That's the right answer. He called Lily that evening from the parking lot of the grocery store, because the car he'd borrowed Barbara's car that week was the only private space he could find. A manager? Lily said. Like a boss? Something like that. How much more money? Quite a bit more. A pause on her end. He could hear the particular quality of her silence that meant she was chewing on something. It was one of the things she'd inherited from him. That chewing on it silence. You liked the cleaning job, she said. I don't like being a janitor, Lily. You never complained about it. That's different from liking it. He looked at the steering wheel. I like to do a job right. I like to take care of things. That's what I was doing. But if I can do more, then you should, she said, simply. The way 8-year-olds say the things that take adults 3 paragraphs. Yeah, he said. Dad? Yeah. I think Mom would say yes too. He sat in the borrowed car in the parking lot for a little while, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went inside and bought groceries and didn't do the math once. There was, meanwhile, the matter of Sandra Pruitt, whose targeted paperwork trail had come to the attention of Victor Marsh through a route that began with a conversation between Bria and Frank and ended with a formal HR review of the document incident. The review found that the incident report had been filed with incorrect information, the conference room log had been accessed and selectively referenced, omitting the plumbing redirect notation that established David's whereabouts. Sandra was presented with the discrepancy and offered the opportunity to explain it, which she was unable to do satisfactorily. She resigned before the formal conclusion of the review process, which saved everyone the paperwork but not the lesson. He wore a charcoal blazer on his first day in the new role. It was not expensive. He'd found it at the Goodwill on Division Street. And it fit well enough if you didn't look too hard at the buttons, but it was the right kind of thing to wear, and he'd gotten it pressed at the dry cleaner that had a deal on Tuesdays. Marcus, the executive assistant on the 14th floor, passed him in the lobby and said, "Good morning, Mr. Carter," which was the first time anyone had called him that in a long time. He arrived at the facilities operations room at 7:45, before anyone else, and spent 15 minutes reviewing the maintenance logs for all 3 campus buildings and making a list of the items he planned to address in the first 30 days. Frank found him there and stopped in the doorway with his coffee. "You're still here," Frank said. "I'm the manager now. I'm always going to be here first." Frank considered this. "All right," he said, and came in and sat down. The first 30 days were not easy. They were interesting in the way that difficult things are sometimes interesting, when you're the right person for them. He learned the procurement systems. He sat through 2 budget reviews and said less than he knew until he understood the patterns, and then said the right things in the right order. He met the contractors. He renegotiated a service agreement that had been costing the company $1,100 a month more than the market rate, not because he was looking for ways to impress anyone, but because the number had seemed wrong when he looked at it. And he'd looked at it until he understood why. Victor Marsh stopped him in the hallway at the end of the first month and said, "You're going to be very good at this." David said, "Thank you in the way that means I know, but thank you for saying it." Lily's treatment stabilized over the following 2 months. The new insurance covered the specialist referral that the urgent care doctor had recommended, and the specialist adjusted her medication to a regimen that worked better with her specific biology. She stopped waking up wheezing in the night, which meant David stopped listening for it, which meant he started sleeping in a different way, deeper, more level for the first time in 2 years. He moved them at the end of the 3rd month. Not to anything grand, a 2-bedroom apartment on a quieter street, with a working elevator and a super who answered his phone and air quality that didn't make Lily's eyes water. She walked through it on the first day with the systematic investigation of someone taking inventory, opening all the closets, pressing the elevator button 3 times to make sure it was reliable, and then declaring it acceptable, which was high praise. She decorated her new room with the paper stars from the old door and added to them. David, who had spent 2 years keeping them from drowning through the sheer mechanical persistence of a man who refuses to stop bailing, found himself in the unfamiliar position of sitting still for a moment and noticing that the water had stopped rising. He called his sister-in-law Barbara to tell her about the apartment. Ellen would have been so relieved, Barbara said. She always worried about you, even before. I know, he said. She used to say you were too stubborn to ask for help. I was, he said. I'm working on it. Amelia Sterling, for her part, kept a careful professional distance, not coldly, not because she was indifferent, but because she understood that the asymmetry in their positions was real and mattered, and that the gratitude she felt for what he'd done 5 years ago could not be allowed to shape how she managed him now. She gave him the resources he needed to do his job. She was honest with him when the budget pressures meant hard choices. She listened when he had recommendations, and pushed back when she had reason to, and treated him the way she tried to treat everyone, as a person whose judgment was worth engaging with seriously. They did not become friends, exactly, in that first year. But something accumulated between them in the way that things accumulate between people who work near each other and tell the truth and don't pretend, a kind of recognition, a mutual understanding of what the other person was made of. She knew what it had cost him to walk into that lobby in the ironed shirt. He knew what it had taken for her to sit across from him and say what she'd said. Neither of them needed to discuss it further. On a Saturday afternoon in April, almost a year after his first day in the Sterling Group lobby, David brought Lily to a company family event. Sterling had started doing them quarterly, an initiative from the culture team that David thought was slightly overdone but had to admit seemed to work. They had rented out a park pavilion, and there were lawn games and a food truck and a general air of enforced but genuine fun. Lily, who had been informed about Amelia Sterling in the way that children are sometimes informed about things when you think they're not paying close attention, but they are, found the CEO immediately, and with the navigational precision of someone who had a specific mission. Amelia, for her part, managed not to look startled when an 8-year-old appeared in front of her with a paper plate of chips and a measuring look. You're the one who gave Dad his job, Lily said. He earned his job, Amelia said. Lily considered this. He said something similar. He would. Another consideration. He works really hard. He does. He used to work nights when I was asleep so he could still make me breakfast. She ate a chip. He thought I didn't know he was tired. But I knew. Amelia looked over Lily's head to where David was standing at the food truck, talking to Frank about something that was making Frank laugh. He had his hands in his pockets. He was standing in the afternoon sun in a way that looked like a man who was not currently holding anything up, who had, for the moment, put the weight down. He's a good man, Amelia said. Lily looked at her with Ellen's brown eyes. Yeah, she said. He is. Then she wandered off toward the lawn games, leaving Amelia holding a moment that didn't need anything added to it. David noticed her standing there and walked over. What was that about? He said. She was conducting a review, Amelia said. She does that. He glanced in Lily's direction. She had recruited 2 other children into a game whose rules she appeared to be inventing in real time. She's very thorough. She gets it from somewhere. He looked at Amelia, who was not looking at him but was watching the park with the expression of someone who had arrived somewhere they'd been trying to get to for a long time and was taking a moment to notice. How are you? He said genuinely. The way he said things when he meant them, without the social lubricant of the question being rhetorical. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer that question when it was asked that way. Better than 5 years ago, she said. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Yeah, he said. Me too. Lily scored a point in whatever game she'd invented and looked back to make sure her father had seen it. He raised a hand. She turned back to the game, satisfied. The afternoon continued around them, ordinary and unremarkable, and in the way of all things that have been earned through difficulty very good. Some debts are not financial. Some are the kind that can't be repaid, but can be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, transformed. What you do for a stranger in the rain doesn't disappear into the dark, it travels forward, through years and lives and changes of fortune, and arrives eventually as something you couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have chosen and wouldn't give back. David Carter knew this, in the way that people know things they haven't put into words. He'd just been there, and he'd done what needed doing. It had been enough.